At the very start of episode 95 of The Far Middle, let me first state that I hope you by now have turned forward your clocks by an hour. That's what we were supposed to have done this past weekend with the start of daylight saving time. If you're listening to this episode and you still haven't adjusted your clocks, I think you're running the risk of being categorized as a procrastinator. Daylight saving time has a horrible reputation. All I hear about is how dumb it is and how unnecessary it is. I saw a poll, 70% of Americans dislike daylight saving time. So maybe in its defense, here's a couple of interesting facts regarding daylight saving time. First, the name, the specifics of the name matter. It's daylight saving time as in singular, not daylight savings time as in plural. And I've been guilty of calling it that on more than one occasion. I'll probably use that inappropriate reference at least once during this segment of the Far Middle, so apologies in advance. Second, the origins of daylight saving time, at least in the United States, they go back to World War I and President Woodrow Wilson. The government wanted to maximize sunlight during the longer days of the year to optimize wartime production and to save energy. But the original idea, before the U.S. adopted it, originally came from a guy from New Zealand, of all places, and he wanted to devise a method to create more time to collect bugs, if you can believe that. Then there's the winners and losers under daylight saving time. I was always told that farmers loved it. That's not true. Farmers are not a fan because they have less time in the morning to do the stuff that farmers have to do, like milk cows. The stakeholder group that was the proponent of daylight saving time was the business lobby. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce lobbied for the change because they felt it would give workers more time to shop in evening daylight. And more recently, the chamber lobbied for daylight saving time because it would stimulate golf apparel and golf equipment sales. So I guess our consumption economy has been around longer than most of us realize, and I guess that golf lobby is a formidable one. By the way, there are two states that do not follow daylight saving time. Hawaii is one of them, out there on its own in the Pacific. But what's the second one? The second state that doesn't follow it, Arizona. Arizona doesn't follow daylight saving time because increasing the active part of a day that is subjected to the Arizona heat by an hour, that would significantly increase energy demand and the strain on the grid, which I found to be really interesting. So there's everything you wanted to know about daylight saving time, but were afraid to ask. It's yet another fringe benefit of being a constant listener on the Far Middle. And now it is time for our dedication to be found in the sports world for episode number 95. So we were just talking about time. And in 1995, you had time accumulating on a consecutive streak that passed quite the milestone record. In early September 1995, Cal Ripken Jr. eclipsed the Iron Horse Lou Gehrig to break baseball's all-time consecutive game streak. And baseball, of course, has always been about the numbers. So here are the numbers when it comes to consecutive game streaks and records. Lou Gehrig, he held the record at 2,130 games until 95, when Ripken eclipsed him at Camden Yards. Ripken's streak continued on for some time, ended up running 17 years in total, and it ended voluntarily, I might add, at 2,632 games. That's the equivalent of over 16 seasons consecutively without missing a game. Unbelievable when one thinks about this, and considering that even very few players have careers that stretch 16-plus seasons. Now, when you play as long as Ripken has, you are bound to accumulate an impressive list of accomplishments. He certainly has done that. 19-time All-Star, World Series champ, two-time American League MVP. He was the American League Rookie of the Year, won a pair of Gold Gloves. He accumulated over 3,000 hits, which is another magical milestone for a career in baseball. And I think one of the most impressive things that he accomplished was he was the recipient of the Roberto Clemente Award for his charity work. Not bad for the 6'4" at the time non-prototypical shortstop, who in many ways redefined the position when you consider players that came after him like A-Rod and Tejada. And by the way, with Cal Ripken holding the record and Lou Gehrig now being second for all-time consecutive games, here's a question for you. Which modern era player is next on that list? Well, number 3 is a gentleman by the name of Everett Scott. He played way back in the day in the 1920s. But number 4 on the list is a player that most of us have heard of and is also one of my personal favorite players from the 1970s and 1980s. He, by the way, holds the consecutive game record for the National League. So those first three, Ripken and Gehrig and Scott, they were all American League players. But in the National League, this is the record holder. He's at number 4 all time. And that player is Steve Garvey, the first baseman for the Dodgers and later for the Padres. Garvey's number 4 at 1,207 consecutive games, which, when you think about it, it's not even half of Ripken's 2,632 games. Sports fans love to debate which records are the ones that are unbreakable. Ripken's consecutive game streak may not be the least likely to be broken, but it is definitely, I think, in the upper quartile of records in terms of degree of difficulty to break in the modern era of pro sports. I think that record is safe. In fact, I don't think there's a current active player across the entire major leagues right now that is within 2,000 games of catching Ripken. So even if his record is going to be broken, think about it this way. The soonest it would happen would be in over a dozen years or so. So you can afford to sleep on this record for a while. I'll keep you updated in future episodes if anybody's getting close. The connections are happening fast and furious early on in episode 95. And for new listeners to the podcast, welcome. Happy to have you. Now, what's this talk about connections if you're new? Well, within an episode, we will discuss a number of topics, each one serving as a dot, and we will lay them out in sequence so that one dot or issue will serve as the connection to the next, and so on until our close of the episode. And this mimics and pays homage to the great BBC television science and technology documentary Connections and its host, Dr. James Burke. I've been a fan of Connections and Dr. Burke since I was a kid, and the structure of each Far Middle episode is designed to pay tribute to it and to him. So here's how it works in practice. Cal Ripken is in the history books of baseball because of math, his ability to accumulate to a never-before-seen level. Math, it's got the ability to clarify the exceptional and to bring truth to a situation that can be clouded by emotion or even opinion. It's that stubborn and beautiful math I want to use to connect to our next item to discuss, which is the math of externality accounting in the energy arena. So first, let's discuss what an externality is exactly. The textbook definition is a side effect or consequence of an industrial or commercial activity that affects other parties without this being reflected in the cost of the goods or services involved. Now, externalities, they look to capture the true net costs or benefits of an activity to society, which means it looks to identify and quantify direct and indirect impacts, both positive and negative. And I've always had an interest in the concept of externalities when it comes to the energy sector, within a range of metrics across economic and environmental and societal considerations. Now, that general interest was recently reawakened, I'll call it, by an inbound request, somewhat random, from a professor at a well-known business school out west who was asking natural gas producers to offer views on competitors in their industry that tend to understate the environmental impacts of their companies and activities. So basically, the professor was looking to construct consensus views among peers of natural gas players in basins across the United States, like Appalachia, where I'm at, to, I would guess, make the point that there are going to be players within the industry who underweight or don't prioritize enough environmental impacts. And what the professor was asking for was data to roll into a wider analysis that looks to assess the externality accounting of natural gas producers in certain basins. Now, you constant listeners know your host by now, and you know that I can't resist this somewhat random request to go unanswered. Quite the contrary, I saw it as an opportunity to take a holistic view of the energy landscape in the context of externality accounting and to offer some thoughts as well as some perspectives on where that might sit. So I formally responded to the professor's request and offered to engage with the professor and his wider team if they were so interested to discuss further. And I had some good dialogue with them back and forth. And on the far middle today, I'll be generalizing my response and thoughts to protect the professor and the business school's confidentiality. I wouldn't mention them specifically unless I got their approval ahead of time. And by the way, I do post my thoughts on my website, nickdeulius.com, which I do encourage you to give a read if you're so inclined, if you're interested in this topic of externality accounting. I can summarize those thoughts here on this episode of The Far Middle, and I want to start by actually giving a lot of credit to the professor because he was asking really big, interesting questions and pursuing thought-provoking work, certainly from my perspective. As I said, externality accounting, it's a very useful tool when applied objectively, but it's also a tool that is often misapplied and mishandled by those that are looking to dial in desired outcomes. So many fail to appreciate that the sequencing of externality screening, it's critically important when assessing entities across the energy industry. Before assessing peers or competitors within a specific type of energy, such as natural gas, one has to first apply externality accounting across different sources of energy and power generation. So what I proposed to the professor was more of a context of peer competitor that is a level higher than and a precursor to what the professor proposed in the original request. The first cut of externalities should be done on an energy source versus energy source basis. In other words, domestic natural gas compared to wind or compared to solar energy sources. Society should screen options of energy sources within the wider portfolio first, and then you set policy and investments to reflect the math of the externality accounting. First, figure out, the energy source that's best is dictated by objective externality accounting. And after that first cut or filtering by energy source, now one can turn attention to different players within individual energy sources. Getting the externality accounting and ranking for discrete energy sources, again, natural gas versus, say, wind or solar, right, that's much more important, getting that right. And it's a prerequisite, frankly, to screening or ranking individual players within an energy source. So that would be company A versus company B within the field of natural gas competitors. Many, including a lot of people in academia and government, they failed miserably to perform the rudimentary externality accounting and ranking of different energy sources. And that leads to wrong-headed energy and climate policies, resulting in dire consequences seen everywhere these days, unfortunately. So conditions are only going to worsen until this failure of how you apply externality accounting and how you do your screening sequentially until they are corrected. So for the purpose of this business school's inquiry, this inbound, I took the position of the natural gas industry, not just a player or a single company within it. And my peers or competition for the purpose of the exercise became the wind and solar industries, not another peer in the natural gas industry. So I took the inbound request, which was asking natural gas competitor versus natural gas competitor type of externality views, and took it a level higher and said, why don't we perform this exercise on a natural gas industry or piece of the energy portfolio basis versus something like wind and or solar. I then went through a quick inventory or tallying of externality benefits that are tied to natural gas as an energy source. And there are a few crucial scientific and engineering realities that are often ignored when assessing the externalities of domestic natural gas by those who are looking to vilify it. So first, natural gas is the most cost-effective form of energy in the United States, and that provides consumers and businesses and homeowners all kinds of savings in energy costs that total in the hundreds of billions of dollars annually. Rampant inflation has caught everyone's attention these days, of course, and the most effective means to curtail general inflation is to simply allow natural gas to provide cheap energy so that energy inflation, and then by extension, general inflation, are mitigated. And natural gas is the superior solution to immediate material greenhouse gas emission reductions. Domestic natural gas has and can continue delivering these benefits while maintaining power grid reliability during the dark days of winter as well as the dog days of summer. Power grid reliability can't be underscored enough. I just mentioned it. So from college campuses to homes and from hospitals to emergency responders and from government buildings to other businesses and facilities, America needs power, and not just here and there, but it needs power that's reliable all day, all night, 24/7, 365 days a year. When natural gas competes with alternative energy sources in a free market, emissions drop, the environmental quality improves of the surrounding air, and as natural gas-fired electric generation topped 40% of the total grid recently, what happened? Power sector emissions dropped by nearly the same percentage. Consider the specific example of the PJM power grid, which is sort of in the mid-Atlantic region of the United States, where I am at. Power sector emissions declined 11% year over year as natural gas grew to 44% of PJM's total capacity. So we know this works because we've seen it work. And by the way, Pennsylvania as a state, it had the highest absolute decline of energy-related CO2 emissions of any state in the country between 1990 and 2018. Why did emissions fall? Because natural gas became the state's largest electricity source. So the data and the facts, when you look at this, PJM power grids, Pennsylvania, nationwide, the data and facts are unequivocal, yet you rarely hear much about this, or you rarely hear about this in the proper context. And there are, of course, additional economic and job creation benefits associated with natural gas. Natural gas across Appalachia, it's breathed new life into forgotten Rust Belt communities. It's brought the building trades programs to full employment, careers that are paying family-sustaining wages. They offer on-ramps to the middle class for a whole host of young adults in both urban and rural communities who aren't able or wanting to attend college. That's sort of the genesis that got the Mentorship Academy within the CNX Foundation up and running, which we've talked about on prior episodes. And manufacturing, which relies on reliable and cheap energy inputs, of course, it's experiencing a resurgence across Appalachia and the Midwest, and that's creating a downstream benefit to the natural gas industry. These things create huge positive externalities when you're doing your externality accounting. And if that were not enough benefit tied to natural gas, you've got the investment and growth in the natural gas industry. What does that do? When that occurs, it grows tax base for governments and for communities. Today, of course, governments are desperate for sustainable endeavors and economic sectors that pay their fair share of tax. You are not going to find another industry in Appalachia, for sure, that pays more of a fair share of tax than the natural gas industry. The bottom line, when you're going through sort of the externality ledger, I'll call it, of the natural gas industry or natural gas as a piece of the energy portfolio, there's never been a better climate jobs program than the shale gas revolution. Performing that objective and clinical externality accounting, that proves it. All right, now let's discuss the externalities of wind and solar. Let's go through the same exercise for those two energy sources. A lot of you constant listeners know this by now, but the most fundamental misunderstanding about wind and solar is the myth that they present a zero carbon footprint. That is simply not true, as in true by a long shot. Carbon footprint, it should be assessed on a life cycle, sort of scopes 1 through 3 basis. And it doesn't matter to the atmosphere, of course, where the CO2 is being emitted in the life cycle of making and running a wind turbine or a solar panel. Just because there's not a significant emission of carbon dioxide once in place doesn't mean that there is a zero carbon footprint. So to accurately account for the carbon footprints of wind and solar, the supply chain of how wind and solar power happen, they have to be traced. So first, right, you need massive environmentally destructive mining to occur in places like Russia and China and Africa for the metals and the materials comprising wind turbines and solar panels to be extracted. And that, of course, presents a huge carbon footprint and large CO2 emissions. Then the raw mining products, they have to be processed to purify them, concentrate them, which also requires huge inputs of carbon power and the associated CO2 emissions. And then components are going to need to be manufactured in factories. Those are typically going to be in China. Those are going to be typically carbon powered, manufactured components. They're then going to have to be shipped thousands of miles on carbon fueled planes and trains and ships and trucks to arrive in places like America. And then once they're here, you're going to have trees and land that are going to be cleared to site pads, and concrete's going to have to be used to build the pads for the turbines and panels to basically sit upon. And that is, of course, going to emit more CO2. New transmission lines are going to have to be run to every wind turbine and solar panel block or array. That requires the felling of more trees to create the rights-of-way, and, of course, the manufacturing of new power lines. That adds to the CO2 emission tally. You're going to need backup and reliable sources of generation when the sun doesn't shine or when the wind isn't blowing, and that will typically be carbon-based power generation, often coal, by the way, creating, of course, more CO2 emissions. And, of course, there is no such thing as a wind and solar-only grid because both sources of electricity are intermittent. Battery storage cannot be scaled to serve as backup, and it has a carbon footprint that might be worse than wind and solar anyway. And it's also worth noting that the double building, I'll call it, the redundancy and maintenance of power generation units, that's going to increase costs to consumers. So affordability takes a hit. And by the way, in 7 to 10 years, you're going to need to perform this process all over again because the turbines become obsolete, they have to be scrapped. By the way, there's no way to recycle wind turbine blades, and the solar panel efficiencies are going to decline year after year. and then you repeat the cycle, which basically will double the carbon footprint. There's also the impact on surface land that wind and solar have to add to the externality analysis. If you're looking at a 100% wind and solar powered grid, wind and solar farms would have to occupy in the United States 300 million additional acres of land beyond what's used to power our economy today. That's building solar and wind farms across a land area equivalent to all these states combined: Arkansas, Iowa, Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Oklahoma. And that's from Bloomberg, by the way, and Princeton University. A ridiculous non-starter, of course, but you know what? No one seems to acknowledge it as such when setting policy. In wind turbines, I mentioned they can't be recycled. They're piling up in landfills. Solar panels contain hazardous materials which have to be disposed of properly, or you risk environmental damage. Most environmentalists, frankly, would consider it hazardous waste until you told them it was from solar. But there you have it. And today, consumers, you think about what we want. We want our eggs to come from cage-free chickens. We want tuna to be caught with dolphin-friendly nets. We want our straws to be biodegradable. And we want our detergents to not use chemicals that are going to be harmful to water ecosystems. And we certainly don't want our jewelry to have gems that are conflict sourced. Yet there is not a home in America today with rooftop solar that can say with certainty that those panels were not partially manufactured by either child or slave labor. The human rights abuses tied to the murky global supply chains that I just walked you through of wind and solar, they're egregious. And yesterday, we were concerned about blood diamonds. Today, the concern should be about blood solar, the externality cost of human rights abuses in the manufacturing of wind and solar. It is quite sobering when you think it through and trace it through. And there's no wind turbine in America today that can warrant it does not kill scores of birds and bats, many of them endangered. Offshore wind farms near New York and New Jersey, they're being constructed in the middle of endangered whale habitat, and wouldn't you know it, the dead whales are now washing up on beaches in New Jersey and New York. So yesterday we were worried about saving the whales and the bald eagle. Today the worry should be how wind turbines lay waste to whales and eagles. Energy production that proves deadly to sensitive species and habitats, that should be reflected in an objective externality analysis. And then there's the issue of sort of taxpayer dollars. Wind and solar, they require tax subsidy that exceeds total subsidy of natural gas, coal, or oil by orders of magnitude. It's not even close. And when you add up the various programs and subsidies to favor wind and solar, the tally registers in the hundreds of billions of dollars, or perhaps even in the trillions of dollars, depending on how you do the math and what time frame you pick. Those valuable dollars, they could be invested elsewhere, and they should be, once again, added as an externality cost. And then there are serious geopolitical externality costs tied to wind and solar. We're seeing that more and more in 2023. China's control of the solar panel supply chain has ballooned to 84% over the past decade, with the country also, by the way, controlling the bulk of critical mineral production and processing necessary for battery storage. This is a critical risk that presents energy security and supply chain and national security concerns that manifest as negative externalities. So when wind and solar inevitably fail to deliver at scale due to engineering realities, energy security in places like Europe necessarily falls back to carbon-based fuels from places like Russia. And that emboldens despots to use the gifted energy leverage to warmonger, as in the case of Ukraine, as we've seen. In climate policies and the resulting flawed reliance on wind and solar, those are the root causes of the war in Ukraine. The policies created a de facto EU reliance on Russian energy. What's the externality cost of Russia and the Ukraine? Whatever it is, however you quantify it, add it to the negative externality tally for wind and solar. So after going through all these major externality benefits of natural gas that are often ignored by the expert class, and adding up all the major negative externalities tied to wind and solar, that, by the way, are conveniently left out or ignored by environmentalists and the experts, when you tally things up, it presents a trio, 3 decisive and obvious conclusions. First, all economic activity and forms of energy have carbon footprints. There is no such thing as truly zero carbon power or a zero carbon economy. Second, natural gas offers the best net externality balance within an energy portfolio. Its externality benefits are substantial and diverse, while its externality costs are quite modest. And third, Wind and solar, they present a massively negative net externality cost to society, particularly when the attempt is to deploy them at scale. These three conclusions, they're the opposite of what is often warranted by the environmental movement and many in government and academia. Climate and energy policies are set that ignore the math and what we just ran through. We share a duty to correct that, constant listeners, and that's why I took the time and effort to respond to the good professor's request. I just mentioned duty, whether it be professional or moral or ethical, and particularly in situations that have huge societal implications, such as energy policy. You get it right, communities and individuals are going to thrive, but if you get it wrong, the consequences can be daunting. And that brings us to our next connection as we wind down episode 95. And that is a movie from 1961 that I consider to be one of the greatest movies of all time that speaks to that subject of duty, moral responsibility when it comes to the law and following it. The movie is Judgment at Nuremberg, and there is much to admire about this movie. First, the movie deals with just some really heavy, fascinating themes. Drama is built around a military tribunal trial that's being held, of course, in Nuremberg, Germany, a few years after World War II, where a group of German judges and prosecutors were standing trial for crimes against humanity. And their actions were tied to their following and upholding of German law at the time of Nazi rule. So there you see the ethical and moral question at the center of the trial. Is it a judge's responsibility to faithfully follow the law, even when such law may be racist and brutal or totalitarian? Where does a judge or the legal professional have a responsibility to ignore or violate the rule of law? Is justice within a legal system faithfully following the rules? Or instead, is justice doing what you feel is right, your own sense of justice, so to speak? Now, in the hindsight of Nazi brutality, the answers today are obvious. But at the time, during the constant and gradual buildup of the totalitarian state, it's easier than you might think for an upstanding ethical individual to fall prey to the groupthink and start upholding and defending decisions that an objective person would find abhorrent. It happens first gradually and incrementally, and then later it occurs very rapidly. And beyond the extremes of Nazism at its worst, it becomes a very slippery slope. If I see a judge in America today, just to give you an example, and that judge is refusing to follow the law, I would look at that judge and consider it unethical on their behalf and a betrayal of their duty. But maybe someone else would view it as a morally just move because they believe that the law that they're refusing to follow, the judge is refusing to follow, is unjust at its core. It is, as I said, a very slippery slope until you get to very extreme times or regimes. And there is the international geopolitical aspect of this film as well, which was really interesting, where the decision following justice, right, may be different than a decision that would defend the West at the time against the growing Russian threat during the Berlin airlift. So support of the German people at that time was going to be very important to the United States and to the West. And if the tribunal came down with a just but a harsh decision at this trial, it wasn't going to win many hearts and minds in Germany. So I'm not going to give away how that ends. You're going to have to watch Judgment at Nuremberg for yourself to find out. And the trial in this movie, it captured this conflict, I think, extremely well, this moral conflict that I'm talking about, to the point where watching the movie, it almost puts you in a position of a mental tennis match where you may be changing your leanings each time you hear from the prosecution and from the defense during the trial. I think Judgment at Nuremberg would be and should be great required viewing for every high school student in America today. It's a lesson in ethics. It prepares you for tough decisions that one is going to face in a profession. It's a great exemplar of the legal process. And on top of it, a student, I think, would learn a lot about that era of history and how international politics truly work. And, the classroom debates after the movie that I would envision, that would be the type that would engage many students, no doubt. Now, the cast of Judgment at Nuremberg is simply spectacular. So listen to this lineup that's in this movie. Spencer Tracy played the leading role as Judge Haywood. What a fine actor, so smooth and likable. Burt Lancaster, another legend. He played the lead defendant, Ernst Janning. Did a great job. And Burt Lancaster says maybe 2 sentences the first 2 hours or so of the movie, and then he lets loose with one of the finest speeches that you'll see in cinema history. It will definitely get your attention if you haven't seen it. Another unbelievable, I think the best, frankly, in this movie, and that's saying something, and in this case, I believe an Academy Award-winning performance, was put in by Maximilian Schell. He played the defense attorney. And this was sort of the coming out role for Maximilian Schell that put him on the path to stardom. He gives a great performance in the movie. Marlene Dietrich played the widow of an executed German officer. He was executed for war crimes in this movie. William Shatner, Captain James T. Kirk himself, has a great role in this movie as Judge Haywood's clerk. And Judy Garland, Dorothy of Wizard of Oz fame, she has a cameo appearance in the film. And there are two lesser-known actors in Judgment at Nuremberg that I do want to acknowledge because they later went on to play key roles in one of my all-time favorite sitcoms, Hogan's Heroes. The first actor was Werner Klemperer. In Judgment at Nuremberg, he was one of the defendants on trial, I believe a former prosecutor, but you might know him better in Hogan's Heroes as Colonel Klink, the lovable and incompetent commandant of Stalag 13. And the second actor, his name was Howard Kane, who had a very brief cameo role in Judgment at Nuremberg, playing the husband of Julie Garland's character. Howard Kane also played the role of Major Hochstetter in Hogan's Heroes. That was the manic Gestapo officer who was always being outwitted by Colonel Hogan and team. The movie Judgment at Nuremberg was nominated for Best Motion Picture. I mentioned that Maximilian Schell won the Best Actor Academy Award. Spencer Tracy was nominated for Best Actor. Judy Garland was nominated for Best Supporting Actress. And I could go on and on. If you like suspenseful movies that make you think, watch Judgment at Nuremberg. If you are a fan of great acting, watch this movie. It is time well spent. Now that's about it for episode 95. We covered some heavy ground, dove deep on some very important issues. I'm going to leave you with a light final connection to clear the palate. We're talking about Nuremberg in Germany. I always found the German language fascinating. Why? Well, on one hand, I don't speak a word of it. But on the other hand, it's the easiest language for me to pick up when first hearing it being spoken by strangers. It's a mysterious yet very distinctive language. National Lampoon had a great way of summing up German. It defined it as German, a language which was developed solely to afford the speaker the opportunity to spit at strangers under the guise of polite conversation. Until next week, be polite and refrain from spitting.